Okay, it's 12:01. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. We'll go ahead and get started. Just hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. We welcome you to today's webinar titled Zoning to Meet Your Community's Planned Vision. In the next hour, we'll hear about how zoning codes play a pivotal role in transit-oriented development, what current trends to consider in zoning practice, code expectations from the developer's perspective, and law-related steps that governments can take to encourage successful development in their station areas. Today's webinar is the second in our Transportation Tuesday webinar series being offered instead of our originally planned half-day planning workshop scheduled for earlier this month. Please join us for the last two webinars on June 2 and June 9 that will focus on changing mobility in the world of transportation. For those of you using social media, we ask that you feel free to tag this webinar series using the hashtag at the bottom of your screen, Transportation Tuesday. All webinar attendees should be already muted. We ask that you please keep them muted and use the chat box for any questions you may have. You can access the chat box by clicking on the chat icon on your toolbar. In the example currently on the screen, the chat icon is shaded in blue. We'll plan to have at least 10 minutes at the end of the webinar to answer any questions you might have. My name is Michael Horsting. I'm the local planning manager at the Regional Transportation Authority. And joining me today on the panel are Jake Seid, senior planner with the Chicago Metropolitan Agency on Planning, Ian Brown, an attorney with Shapiro and Associates Law, and Kurtis Pozsgay, senior planner with the Village of Bensenville, Illinois. Today's webinar will cover these four areas related to successful zoning practices that will help you allow for the type of development envisioned in many plans, including downtown plans or transit-oriented district plans that you might have. After a brief overview of the ways the RTA can help municipalities with planning and zoning activities, Jake will speak to some more detail about zoning practices and maybe some emerging topics related to transit-oriented zoning. Ian will help us better understand the developer's perspective to zoning codes and what they're looking for, as well as share some legal considerations. And then Kurtis will end our panel today by sharing Bensenville's story of their planning process and their subsequent zoning amendments. But first off, the RTA has been involved with planning communities around public transportation and encouraging transit-supportive land use for over 20 years now through our community planning program. By providing technical assistance to complete plans as well as support to implement those plans, the work of the RTA's program has really encouraged municipalities in the region to develop walkable and more sustainable communities near transit stations and along transit served corridors. You might ask, why does the RTA transit agency do this? Well, we do because supporting the goals of municipalities who have control over land use and development decisions near transit services helps to create more places for people to live and work near transit. Doing so then helps the RTA meet its strategic goals for building the strengths of the transit system and keeping the region's transit system strong and competitive. One way the RTA supports municipalities through the program is just assisting with the creation of a TOD plan, transit-oriented development plan. As a reminder, TOD is the style of community development that offers a mix of land uses and housing options. It's more compact style of development, pedestrian scale environment, all within walking distance of quality transit service. By encouraging residents to replace driving trips with transit and walking and cycling, TOD areas offer many community benefits that could include safer streets or reduced congestion, lower infrastructure costs, and potentially even household cost savings. The RTA also supports municipalities with updating their zoning code in TOD areas. So once a community completes one of these TOD plans, the process of turning that vision into reality has really just begun. And many municipalities need to translate their planning goals and vision into a policy or policies that allow them to build the walkable mixed-use neighborhoods around our transit system. So having those appropriate land use regulations and design guidelines and review processes in place is important to attracting to the type of the development that was envisioned in their plan. Although the traditional downtown style of development that features mixed-use buildings and fronting pedestrian-friendly streets is widely recognizable, many zoning codes were written after automobile-oriented and suburban development styles became so prevalent. Therefore, this form of walkable mixed-use development that is vital to TOD is often prohibited in zoning codes or allowed only through a really complex approval process. Sometimes local zoning codes are much more restrictive of new multifamily housing than they are of single-family housing. And in some communities simply ban multifamily housing outright in their zoning code. Or in other cases, municipalities might restrict building height or unit density to such a degree that it makes development financially unfeasible. And finally, the approval process in codes can be sometimes prohibitive to increasing density near transit stations. Developers often need to seek a variance to zoning codes or adhere to a really lengthy discretionary process, both of which have proven to be risky and cost prohibitive as an approach to them. So by streamlining the development review process in transit-served municipalities, really can make attractive more development in your downtown transit areas. So in summary, TOD zoning code updates offer local governments that opportunity to rewrite land use regulations for transit-served neighborhoods in a manner that is consistent really with the goals established in their TOD plans. There are many ways to accomplish this, including just simple text revisions to a zoning ordinance or creating an overlay district that establishes special provisions and standards for the area, or introducing form-based codes that provide less focus on how buildings are used and a little bit more focus on how they look and how they're built. So the other speakers today will speak more to the details of this. We'll start off with Jake Seid from CMAP. Jake, if you want to take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Mike. Can you guys hear me okay?
I sure do.
Okay, great. Well, hello, everyone. It's great to be with all of you today, and so happy to be part of this great panel. My role here is to get into those brass tacks of zoning, to really address some of those challenges that Mike was outlining here at the outset. I want to talk about the standards that are in your codes and what options you have for TOD zoning requirements. As some of you may know, CMAP's local technical assistance program is very similar to RTA's community planning program. CMAP's LTA program uses funding from the federal government to work with communities on a variety of planning projects. The goal of all this work is to help implement the Regional Comprehensive Plan onto 2050. Now, we have completed more than 200 LTA projects since the inception of the program in 2010 on projects both large and small. This includes comprehensive plans, housing plans, shared services plans, parking studies, and bike ped plans, just to name a few. I'll go to the next slide, please, Mike. So now in terms of zoning, we've worked with more than a dozen communities on ordinance updates in the last 6 years or so. Our goals in terms of zoning are to implement the community's vision, address outdated standards, updating standards that don't fit with the current development climate, or removing things altogether. For example, if you have a haberdashery store in your use list, you probably don't need that anymore. The big picture here is just creating user-friendly standards for residents, developers, and planning staff so they can pick up the ordinance or take a look at it online and not need to consult an attorney to understand what's in the code. No offense, Ian. Now, in the post-COVID world, our thoughts on downtowns are evolving as we all are right now. We're thinking about how downtowns can continue to serve as centers of our communities. whether they're transit oriented or not, really. How can downtowns continue to provide amenities to residents and visitors? In the future, more people may work from home than head to the office every day, but downtowns can still be that center for local retailers and restaurants, libraries, institutions, and healthcare. And we all know that at some point in the future, transit will return, because if we're all driving as a region, we're not going to be going anywhere. We know that. So let's go to the next slide, please, Mike. So there are 4 big components of zoning to think about as we talk about TOD areas: yard and bulk regulations, design standards, the types of uses that are allowed in TOD areas, and off-street parking regulations. Next slide, please. So first, yards and bulk. When we think about the regulations that make up a TOD area, the first thing that comes to mind is minimum lot area and minimum lot width. Many codes that we work with provide minimums for both. For example, 7,000 square feet for lot area and 50 feet for lot width. We've actually found that it's more useful to specify lot width in TOD areas rather than lot area, because it's the width of these storefronts that make for a walkable TOD environment. It could be 50 feet, but we encourage you to take a look at your GIS or your Google Earth. It may be closer to 25 feet or 35 feet, depending on where you are in the region. Long story short, we don't want to let a lot area requirement get in the way of a walkable downtown if it's creating nonconformities or that sort of thing. Next is front and corner side yards. To help enhance the pedestrian environment for TOD areas, all of CMAP's codes specify a front and corner side yard maximum rather than a minimum. For example, the maximum could be 10 feet to allow area for outdoor dining in front of a restaurant, or it could be 0 feet if the goal is to bring buildings up to the sidewalk. Either way, as long as there is a maximum in place to create that street wall effect, that's so important to downtowns, that's what we're looking for. Finally, wanted to talk a little bit about lot coverage, especially in light of the weather that we had over the weekend. We don't often think of our downtowns and TOD areas as places with a lot of permeable surfaces that allow stormwater to be brought into the soil. Downtowns often have very high percentages for maximum lot coverage, for example, 90, 95, or 100%. In order to strike a balance between these competing needs, CMAP's been experimenting with allowing maximum lot coverage at, say, 80% of the lot, and then on top of that, allowing a portion with semi-pervious coverage, say 20% of the lot, which would include permeable pavers. So that gets the site up to 100% developable area, but still allows the space for the water to seep into the soil. Places like Brookfield, Northbrook, and Villa Park are already utilizing this concept, which was popularized by our colleagues at Duncan Associates and Codometrics in some of their work in communities across the country. Okay, so next is design standards. CMAP uses a hybrid approach to design. We incorporate elements of form-based coding and elements of Euclidean zoning both, but our big goal is to make the codes as easy as possible to administer for municipal staff. CMAP's approach combines form and use to provide a balance between the impact of each. Now, some of the big design elements are outlined on this slide. On the front of the building, you can see minimum street frontage. That's the proportion of the site that's made up of a building as opposed to driveways. In front yards, this proportion should be very high, probably about 90 to 100%. The second thing here is the principal entrance location. How does a customer or a resident enter the building? The principal entrance should be in the front, but there could be a rear entrance as well. But just to have that environment where it makes people comfortable to walk in from the front of the building rather than always through the parking lot. Next is parking location. And we're going to talk about parking in a little bit too, but most of the time we recommend having parking in the rear of the lot. Even better than that is if there's a cross-access easement in the rear yard so that adjacent lots can connect to each other with parking areas. That way more of the lot can be dedicated to building and less to parking and driveways. The last item shown on the drawing is minimum transparency, how much of that first floor facade is made up of windows. This creates a more pleasant walking or shopping experience for the people on the sidewalk. Our codes also talk about a number of other design elements as well. Things like a defined base, middle, and top for your building. You can see the base of this drawing is set off with an awning and a different style of windows. The middle of the building is pretty plain Jane, and then the top has some sort of roof design that indicates that it's the top of the building. Our codes often specify building materials as well, things like brick and natural stone. We also require facade articulation to break up flat planes, so either with columns or pilasters or reveals, just so you don't get that big blank wall that you see on the side of a big box store or something like that. Okay, next slide, please. So I've just got 2 slides left here. So for uses, as Mike mentioned earlier, mixed-use development is the cornerstone of transit-oriented development. Dwellings above ground floor, retail, and restaurants. But standalone multifamily housing is also really important here. We're talking about age-restricted, non-age-restricted, apartments, condos, whatever. Any way to get more people in that TOD area. And, we're interested in mixed-use blocks as much as mixed-use lots. And in our opinion, the days of requiring first-floor retail in our TOD areas was already waning pre-COVID. CMAP doesn't include these requirements in our codes at all, actually. Instead, we really like the idea of having that flexibility on the first floor. So something that could convert from residential to commercial or vice versa based on where the market is. Next is townhouses. Now, one question I think we all have is whether the 2020s might be a golden age for townhomes, in the upcoming decade. They have separate entrances. They work well in single-family neighborhoods. They can have common open space amenities. In some circles, 2020 was supposed to mark the end of the single-family zoning district anyway, places like Minneapolis and California, and maybe that spirit can find a way to continue. We really like the idea of townhouses in TOD areas and like it even better in zoning districts adjacent to TOD areas to kind of feed population into those centers. The last thing I wanted to touch on in terms of uses was accessory dwelling units. Now, there are a lot of ways to handle ADUs. The housing demand in your community will often be a deciding factor on whether they are a viable option or not. That, and of course, the interest of your local elected and appointed officials. CMAP is very interested in providing ways to allow ADUs to provide those housing options in our communities. And some ways that we manage ADUs in our codes is how they're allowed. So either as a detached ADU, in a garage or on top of a garage, or as an attached part of the principal structure. We often include a size limit. Something around 900 square feet works in a lot of municipalities. Talk about the design of the ADU, compatible materials between the principal structure and the accessory structure. And then the final thing to think about is occupancy. Finding a way for the property owner to either live in the principal structure and rent out the ADU, or to live in the ADU and rent out the principal structure, just to have that maintenance presence on site. Okay, next slide, please. The last thing I wanted to cover was off-street parking. Off-street parking requirements are almost always inflated in a lot of the codes that we look at when we're starting new projects. So our goal is to right-size them to bring them in line with updated standards. For more recent codes, CMAP has been working to get rid of parking minimums altogether. And this idea is either really exciting or really terrifying for the people we're talking to about that. In places where getting rid of parking minimums is a tough sell, we provide our number of gateways to requiring less parking. One way to do that is with district exemptions. So maybe off-street parking isn't necessary in your entire TOD district because of a mix of on-street and off-street parking, let's say municipal parking lots or something like that. We also offer parking credits to provide a mechanism to reduce your required minimum down to zero. Some examples of ways to do that is the proximity of the site to a transit station, the proximity of the site to a municipal parking lot, or offering land bank future parking or a fee in lieu of parking. Next is required bike parking. So in the post-COVID world, we may see a significant uptick in biking. I'm not sure if anyone's tried to buy a bike recently, but there are waiting lists out there right now. CMAP's codes require short-term bike parking for everyday uses like businesses and libraries, and then longer-term parking for residential uses, apartments and condos, that sort of thing. Last thing we wanted to talk about is pickup and drop-off areas. Initially we thought about these for access to ride-sharing services, but this could also be a really good option for pickup and delivery of goods, especially since people aren't really too interested in going into stores these days. So finding flexible ways to use existing parking spaces for our current needs for vehicles. So those are the 4 big things that we consider when we're thinking about zoning in TOD areas. Looking forward to any questions you might have later. And Mike, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, Jake. Thank you so much. Great insights. Thank you for providing, that level of added detail to some strategies about how to amend zoning codes. And I really like how you brought in some, COVID-19 considerations, some things to think about as we go forward with the pandemic. So on next to Ian Brown. Ian, if you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks, Jake. My name is Ian Brown. I'm an attorney at Shapiro & Associates Law. We're located in Northbrook, north suburbs of Chicagoland. And I just to relate to, I believe most of the audience here, I have a planning background, AICP, and a planning background through education, master's program in the city. So, and now I practice in all of the Chicago suburbs, and or a lot of them, any of them really, for the past several years, focusing on zoning and land use and development. Next slide, please. Okay, thanks. Okay, so just a quick overview of what I want to talk about right now are important factors in development projects. Just to kind of keep in mind, as it was my experience coming from planning to the private side that there's a lot of need to connect or to kind of remind developers, where local governments come from and vice versa. So just to throw back some principles that I found first, and then hit some law-related steps that local governments can take to not only hopefully allow, but also encourage successful development, to kind of expand somewhat on the steps that Michael and Jake were outlining for you just a minute ago. And so the 4 subtopics in that category I wanted to talk about are going to be comprehensive plan, zoning code barriers, proper approval process through the zoning entitlement process, and then a little shout out to some COVID considerations in complying with the Open Meetings Act. So to start with, local governments, are not developers. They're not equipped to be developers primarily. Of course, that doesn't mean that local governments have never tried to be, or even have successfully never been. I mean, there's definitely examples of some good development or development type work that local governments have done and are doing right now, but it's still not their primary function. And it's on average best if they, understand the proper scope of involvement, the best way to be involved in land use in most cases, right? But I would say it's a general, a good rule to remember. And this just gives you a little bit of a background on, where, what that role is, coming all the way from the U.S. Constitution through the Illinois Municipal Code granting police powers, all the way from, the ultimate sovereignty of the federal government all the way down to local government, which includes that police power includes local land use authority and the tools to enact that authority. Development is just not one of those core functions, right? They set the land use policy, which is a really big deal. Something like 20% of global GDP is based in real estate. Land use policy is a really big deal that, I think general public sometimes doesn't appreciate fully. And the responsibility that local governments have in making sure that their land use policy does actually implement and ensure, try to ensure at least the public welfare, which is the legal basis for that land use authority. So to enact that policy, though, developers, we still need developers, and it's good to understand, because we need developers in order to, enact that policy. It's good to understand what it is that developers are looking for, right? And because you may have a development opportunity in your community that you think is great, and a lot of Chicago suburbs have really fantastic opportunities with, between Pace and Metro. It's something that most other suburban areas in the country, and other metro areas, they drool over. They would love to have, a rapid, reliable commuter train and wide-ranging Pace bus system, the shuttle bug system, that just doesn't exist in most areas. And I've always felt that it is just woefully underutilized. And maybe that's a general sentiment here. And I think a lot of us are here because we want to see it utilized better. So you may have this opportunity, but why is there? You may have a train station, but there's nothing around it. Why? And so part of the reason, that development just doesn't magically appear is because it can be very risky, and that's what I want to kind of lead in with. Next slide, please. Thanks. So some of those risk factors. And there's a wide variety of risk factors in development, and especially some other, certain types of development are more risky than others and more complicated than others. Affordable housing is just incredibly complicated. Just the financing of how all of this gets built. I've seen it drawn out in a course I took, just the connections that it takes to get tax credits. Into a form that the developer can actually use immediately to start construction and pay for costs. And I mean, it's a spider web. It's crazy. Which is another, going back to, local governments are not the best developer just because it can be very complicated, right? And so, taking a step back from the general risks that are involved in complexities involved in development, what can local governments do, and where are those risks, right? That are somewhat in the purview or somewhat in the control or influence, at least, of local governments. And one of the more obvious things is that a lot of what is in demand for development is not as of right. It requires all sorts of approvals. Some of them are pretty hard to get, if not often impossible, in certain areas or certain communities, right? And so, for example, apartments, multifamily, it's, of course, most areas of the, residential areas of communities don't allow for multifamily. It's strictly single family, unless you live in certain areas like Minneapolis or Oregon. It's single family zoning, and anything else is just never going to be approved or even considered, which is unfortunate because that's often the only thing that a developer can get approved for is apartments right now, or at least the recent past. Things are of course changing right now, so we'll see what happens. But the developers, the market say apartments, and communities zoning codes and residents say otherwise, right? So there's some risk there because they may be going through these long and uncertain approval processes, spending, application costs are, it's not, a drop in the bucket as far as, the overall development costs go. However, putting together one of these applications is, many of us are aware, they require a number of planning documents, right? You have to hire engineers and attorneys and architects, and sometimes lobbyists, all these soft costs that go into all these planning documents that can add up to, hundreds of thousands of dollars for some of these large projects. And they have to do them anyways, but they would like to know if they're doing it, that they're not going to just be sunk costs, right? And then in the meantime, they're paying the property owner, because they typically don't own the property. Sometimes they do own the property, but either way, they're paying holding costs, right? They're paying the property owner to put it on hold, while they go through the approval process. Sometimes that's, I've heard of 30 grand a month for a small piece of property, which is, a little on the high end, but, it gives you an idea of, it can be tens of thousands of dollars, each month sometimes, not always, but it can be a lot, for holding costs. And then at the same time, there's no cash flow. There's a lot of times at least, right? If it's vacant property, then there's no income coming in. So, the combination of cost plus, no income can kill a project before it even starts. Right. And so, and then, if they do want to go through, and start the approval process, they may go through, it may know for sure, because maybe they've been burned in the past where they spent all this money only to be denied. That's a big risk for developers. And a lot of these approval processes, they can take, in our experience, 3 to 6 months on average for even simple stuff for a special use permit. For more complex stuff, a year or more if they have to go through it, a number of times, depending on the issues and complexities. So the timeline can be a significant risk, and just the uncertainty of the approval process can really, be a massive financial burden for a lot of projects. I've seen, the just zoning regulations and uncertainty and the cost and stuff like that can add 40%, the total like about 40% of some projects. It can be a lot. So, and then, and after that, even if you have this project is successfully approved, the developer and the local government risk a lawsuit or multiple lawsuits contesting that the ordinance, the passage of the ordinance, right? And it's usually by an objector, neighbor, and it will allege, that there are a number of things I'll kind of get into in a little bit of detail in a second. But either way, it's expensive to defend whatever they allege, and however much credibility there is into it. You still have to, a developer or any defendant in a lawsuit has to defend, which is a significant amount of legal costs, maybe putting together, all sorts of records and plans and times, in court, and it may just be, it could be a year before you even get anywhere in the case. I mean, litigation can be extremely expensive, tens of thousands of dollars. I mean, 20 grand minimum, right? I would say on average. To be conservative, just to have a minor defense of any litigation. So it can be very expensive, right? So there's a significant amount of risk in that was somewhat within the local government purview, and the litigation they'll most likely sue the local government as well. So it's definitely not only in the interest of these things aren't in the interest of the local government, or the developer, but also the local government. Next slide, please. Excuse me, took a sip of water. So comprehensive plan community's comprehensive plan is one of the big steps that I think, and based on my experience in this, is what local governments can do. Not only do we, as I think a lot of us know here, it's very important for a number of things, right? Getting public's, consent and approval on a lot of items, features of their community, getting staff aware, making staff aware of what the public wants, educating the public, educating developers on what public wants, having the officials know what the public wants so they can hang their hat on, on something when they make their decisions. But I, want to stress here that it's also very important for judges. When there is post-approval litigation, right? Objector, doesn't like the ordinance and objects in court, files a lawsuit. The court in that legal challenge, they have to. It's often, the challenge is the ordinance is arbitrary and capricious, and so and it's basically, that decision wasn't based on good underlying evidence, right? They didn't consider what they should have considered, they being the local government. The court will look to what's called LaSalle factors. This is the courts in Illinois, right? This is Illinois specific case law, but I imagine it's somewhat similar in other places. But this is Illinois at least. So 3 of those, there's 9 total factors that the court goes through, right? And so 3 of those are directly or indirectly related to a comprehensive plan. So you can see 3 of them here. Does a comprehensive plan exist? Does the challenge ordinance, is it in harmony with that comprehensive plan? And does the community need this use? And they'll often look to the comprehensive plan to gauge the need for the use, because the comprehensive plan is one of the best, if not maybe the only real gauge or indicator of what the community input has been. The next part I just kind of said, but the corridor plans, I just want to mention, such as what the RTA can provide, and the LTAs of, part of CMAP, corridor plans and consultants and stuff like that too, they can be considered comprehensive plans. Even if they're not necessarily incorporated into the comprehensive plan, it's essentially a mini comprehensive plan, right? So courts will look at that. It's important to have these, from all perspectives. In my opinion, the zoning code and map should also be guided by a comprehensive plan. I think ideally, just my personal opinion, I think that things should be codified. Zoning code or the comprehensive plan should be codified in the form of mirroring it to the zoning code and map to the comprehensive plan. But at least it should be totally out of whack, which is often the case. The comprehensive plan may call for something completely different than what is currently in the zoning code, and the zoning code may never be updated. If it is, it's in piecemeal. Ideally, they should be somewhat similar. Thank you. Zoning code barriers is another thing that local government should look at. So what I've found to be one of the more frustrating things, parts of approaching, helping a client, small business developer to do what they want to do with the property. Often it's near a train station even, or somewhere in the commercial corridor, is they need multiple approvals, right? Possibly a text amendment and a zoning map amendment, and then they'll also need a special use permit once they get into the district that they need, and once they get in that language that they need, because maybe cosmetic tattooing, for example, wasn't ever considered by the zoning code, right? And so there's a number of pieces that have to come together in order for for one business to get started, one project to be built. And a lot of communities don't allow those steps to be done in tandem. They have to be done separately, or they've never considered it before. So their default is it has to be separate. And some of them aren't like that, but some of them can be. And that can double the time that it takes. And it, not only double the time for the developer, but it, increases, it's more time consuming for local government, and it gets a little bit messy. And it's also an indicator that there's an outdated code, in need of more of a comprehensive update. So and the third point here, rigid parking minimums. I know Jake touched on this, but one of the items that I think has worked well for some of our developer clients is not, definitely reducing parking minimums for sure, because there's, a lot of current minimums overestimate the actual need, and therefore increases cost, right, for these developments, but and therefore pass it on to tenants. But shared parking agreements, it can work really well, especially in mixed use, because the different types of uses, they have different parking needs, right? Different times of the day. So for example, one client has a TOD next to a metro station, and metro needs parking during the day. And a lot of the uses at night, or a lot of the uses on the TOD site, they're cinema, retail, restaurants. Their most active times for parking are at night. So it's, it's a really, nice, in harmony there, right? And so a shared parking agreement with Metro, it worked out really well. Metro was actually very receptive to it, ultimately. So, and, another example is working with, potentially as a public lot. So, another a developer in Evanston, he found that Evanston wanted this TUD project to offer parking for for the residents. It was I believe, an apartment tower. And with the ultimate agreement was the developer had to build a parking garage that was part of some of the spaces were public spots and for other retailers, and some of the spaces were had to be reserved for the residents. And that got built and it was fine. But a couple years in, the developer found that the residents really didn't want to any of these spots. I mean, there were some, of course, that used the spots, but almost very, very few. So that ultimately Evanston can then decide that, hey, those spots aren't being used, we'll just use more for the public. And so the flexibility in there in both of those really, I think, helped make those projects work. Next slide. So another aspect that local governments can do to help reduce the risk, and it goes a lot to that post-approval litigation risk, is ensuring that the approval process is done correctly and follows not only the local government's own rules for the approval process, but also state rules. And it's that sometimes includes rules that aren't in the code, Illinois Municipal Code, but also ensuring that you're following some case law, right? One of the seminal cases here, the Clarence case, was it clearly says that due process rights must be afforded to property owners, whether it's the owner whose property is the subject of the hearing, or sometimes they're also certain neighbors if they're close enough and affected sufficiently. Some of the example issues that you'll see in a legal challenge are some essential info objectors can allege, and I'm not necessarily hating on objectors. Some of them have legitimate concerns, and we've represented some. But just to give you an idea of some of what the disputes are. So essential information was not included in the application, therefore not giving the objectors sufficient due process. They didn't know that there was this major aspect to this project. They had no idea about they were blindsided after the decision was made, and it should have been part of the application. Improper notice. Notice is a really important part of the entitlement process. Notice has to be done. It's really easy. It's relatively easy to do, but it's also relatively easy to mess up. And I've seen it done before, and it's just it's a shame for a technicality to really bring down the approval process and make all these efforts on all parties for naught. Sometimes a crucial witness may not have been made available for cross-examination by members of the public. They just, maybe an architect wasn't, a crucial member of the development team, who could answer, only he could answer or she could answer questions, they weren't made available even despite requests. So a number of things to keep in mind. Just some examples. Next slide, please. I know I'm running, I don't want to cut too much into in Kurtis time, so I'll let you read this list here on your own. I hope the slides are made available. If not, feel free to reach out to me. But these are the other Sinclair factors, and essentially, it's just the point of this slide is just make sure on the record, at hearing in the hearing materials, so it's on, the court can see the transcript, because the court's going to look at the record, what the local government essentially makes the record through application, the transcript, what's said at hearing by public officials. You need to make sure that the harms and benefits of the project are fully considered, or at least reasonably considered, right? And these are those other LaSalle Sinclair factors that the court is going to look through. So, zoning and nearby property, if they're compatible, private hardship, purpose of zone purposes, and like the time has been vacant. Take some time to make sure that you understand what the courts look at, so you know what to make sure to include in the record, and then you kind of can check the boxes, and that'll help ensure things goes a little more smoothly. Getting to COVID-19 compliance with Open Meetings Act, as I think we all probably know, the governor suspended certain rules of OMA. Physical presence not required for quorum. Remote participation is now allowed to make up that quorum for public officials. If meeting's not essential, they say don't have it. If it is, then it should still meet the requirements of open and convenient for members of the public. So some best practices to get to there. If for development related, if it's controversial, consider postponing it. If you do want to go forward, consider getting indemnification from the applicant developer, right? Because you may be stuck with a nice legal bill if it's contested in court for the reasons that we were just talking about. That's our advice, at least. Make materials available prior to the meeting, uniform document numbering, make rules available prior to hearing. Pre-registration cannot be required, but helpful, right? Those are all points to remember that goes not only to Open Meetings Act, making it open and convenient, but also to the due process requirements, making sure that everyone is able to, fully understand what's happening, able to ask questions as appropriate, and so on. So anyways, if there's any questions later on, I'm happy to talk more about this. So thank you.
Ian, great information. Thank you very much. It's interesting to hear kind of the developer's perspective and what kind of situation they're in. Some good food for thought for us on that one. So we now turn it to a local experience, Bensenville, and Kurtis is up next. Kurtis, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks, Ian and Jake. I'm Kurtis Pozsgay, Senior Planner with the Village of Bensenville. I'll probably fly through this, so if there's any questions, you can always email or reach out on LinkedIn or something, and I'm happy to answer them at a next time. So first, I'm just going to orient you to where Bensenville is, in case you're not aware. We are just west of O'Hare. Here's sort of our general location, in south of Elk Grove. The new 390s running through our northern end, and kind of bordered by 83 and York Road. And then I want to give you just a brief history lesson here. So here's the 2005 aerial, and the blue section is our downtown. So that's what we'll be talking about when we're discussing kind of TOD here. And this yellow section is what was taken from us in the O'Hare modernization. So if you go to the 2020 aerial here, you'll see how far Chicago extended the airport. Now kind of bordering York Road there, but you see the kind of the drastic change there. Head back to 2020. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and so you can almost see too a little bit of how the downtown, the extension to the east there was sort of taken. We lost kind of a chunk of our downtown across York Road there. So yeah, the city of Chicago, they acquired about 665 residential homes in that take and about 110 businesses. So 2,000 residents were displaced. The village lost about 26 million in EAV. The property tax loss of roughly 1.7 million. That's about 300 acres that was taken from us. And this doesn't even include the tollway work, which is still ongoing. That there's a lot of property taken with that as well. So that sort of sets us up where we are with Bensenville and the RTA. So we in 2008, kind of right as all that was happening, we applied to the RTA's Community Planning Program, and 2011 is when the final report was approved. So some highlights in there, definitely, it's a transit improvement plan. So for the downtown, a lot of talk about walkability, infill, new street connections, increased density and housing types, and really this is the first big planning studies since that O'Hare modernization program, and although it focused on the TOD kind of metro pace, it was really much larger in scope. It's really almost a full comprehensive plan in the way that it was extended throughout the village. So it's kind of interesting to see. So in the next couple of slides here, I show you just sort of the downtown concepts. They had some sort of short-term concepts and then long-term, but really what you're seeing here is the village, kind of owns some sites. recommending some redevelopment, kind of streetscape work on some of the sites, both long and kind of the long range, kind of more grandiose plans about redeveloping some of these blocks. And so next, kind of right before or kind of right after that was approved, we again went back to RTA because they had this program set up called Setting Ideas in Motion, which was basically the implementation phase or technical assistance for all the the previous planning work they'd been doing. So we applied and were approved for a technical assistance developer panel. So it was basically RTA partnered with ULI, and they brought one of their technical assistance panels out to Bensenville. And we met with a panel of developers and sort of local officials, and had kind of a day-long conversation. And some highlights that came out of that were, the creation of a facade improvement program, which actually happened and we utilize to this day, although it's sort of in flux now with budget issues moving forward. I'm sure everybody's experiencing. We did they suggested doing a market study for all, because if you look to the little map here, these are all village-owned parcels at the time, and for the most part still are. And they basically, suggested doing a market study to see what we could support for new housing down here, which we did. So we went out. Actually, one of the first things I did coming in here suggest that we do a market study for a residential parcel, the kind of larger one we own downtown that had sort of gone out. We actually went out for RFP. That was one of the other summary highlights for this village-owned site. And actually, I've had a couple development concepts for it, never quite taken off. Some approved plans that never were fully realized, or the developer kind of did maybe a bait and switch and didn't want to, in the end, do what that was approved. So we did this market study, and are still, and I'll get into it a little later, still working on development of this site, but we're much closer to realization, and right now. So after that, and sort of almost in conjunction with that, Bensenville started working with CMAP on their LTA program. So in 2012, we applied to the LTA for a comprehensive plan update, and almost immediately applied again for the zoning update. So we were approved for both. The comprehensive plan was adopted in 2015, and the zoning ordinance was adopted in 2019. The zoning ordinance was a much more involved process. Obviously, you can see the amount of years it took to get there, and much of what Jake talked about is really what was implemented in our new zoning ordinance. It's a much more streamlined process. It's a lot skinnier ordinance. If you looked at the amount of pages that are in the new one compared to the old ordinance, much more streamlined, a lot more visuals, a lot easier for kind of the layman to go into the ordinance and read. Which was really important for us. It makes it easier on everyone when they're applying or, seeing what they can do in the districts. It includes design requirements and gives us a review kind of process and authority. It's the use list is more generalized, which is important. I'll get to it a little bit here when we talk about the TOD. But instead of being really specific, and Jake jokes about that haberdasheries thing, but that was actually in an ordinance that we redid in Berwyn. I don't remember if we had it out here, but getting rid of these really specific old uses that over time probably can go out of use. Or Ian even mentioned about maybe a new type of tattoo place that comes into vogue that isn't in your ordinance, and then you got to go back and kind of modify your ordinance to be able to allow this. Well, our new zoning ordinance kind of generalizes these uses and lets so that there might be neighborhood retail. Instead of putting all these individual retail uses, it's a much more generalized category that and then definitions sort of help you get to explain what is a neighborhood retail. Which helps a ton on, again, just the kind of the ever evolving, uses that are out there. We attempted to allow ADUs in our ordinances. It ultimately didn't make it. And I do want to touch on the legal review. We did, CMAP had a consultant on board. Our legal reviewed it as well. I mean, our legal review was kind of a snap. I mean, it was really easy and no major issues. So, I just something to touch on. It was, nothing to be afraid of, but, obviously with the experience of CMAP and what they've done with the LTA and zoning ordinances in recent years, it was really easy and for us to go through, actually. So, touching on the highlights for the TOD, kind of the downtown area, and you'll recognize that that little drawing that from Jake's slides as well. So, zero lot line development is in our downtown. It's just, right up to the street, no commercial parking requirements. For residential, it's 1-to-1, but we offer all sorts of ways. Jake had mentioned this about ways to reduce this. Being next to transit, shared. We got a bunch of village-owned lots, so there are lots of ways to help get those parking reductions. Bike requirements are in all the parking requirements now. And then design requirements is the big thing, so in ours, it's a 95% minimum street frontage on your primary street. Parking has to be located in the rear yard. You're talking 60% minimum transparency. And then the principal entrance, as Jake had mentioned, must be on the front or corner side facade. The other thing I think to kind of touch on is height. We only really limit it by what kind of the airport restricts, because we have restrictions being so close. Although, we don't ever really anticipate anything getting developed probably higher than we do have basically an 8-story building down here right now. That's probably about where the market we see it. But, for the most part, we kind of allow you to do what you can do with the market's going to dictate how big these buildings, can go. And, and for the most part too, your parking requirements and things, we're probably going to limit, based on the number of residences you have in the development. So, some other things that we've done since and kind of during all that planning process and such. So we've done a streetscape here in recent years. So 2017, we did north of the tracks. 2018, we redid Railroad Avenue and the Metro lot, kind of reconfigured everything there and added some dedicated pace lanes and such. And then in 2019, we did south of the tracks. A variety of funding here, but just really wanted to touch on kind of the remake of downtown since all the planning and zoning work. Here is the kind of what the streetscape looks like. So not only are we talking about the standard, wider sidewalks, bump outs, street crossings, but we didn't have a lot of on-street parking. So we incorporated a ton of on-street parking, which is great, for a ton of reasons. Obviously, the businesses have more options to park, for customers, but it's also a buffer now between your much wider sidewalks and the streets, but just creates a much more downtown feel. So, we went from, I think total spaces, we lost a couple. I think, before we had 180 spaces total, because we had a bunch of diagonal parking on one of our streets that we got rid of and changed to parallel. But after we went to 172, so lost a few spaces. But it should be noted that the non-commuter went from 78 to 94. So we gained a ton of on-street parking that's non-commuter, and really it's kind of the metro and along the tracks, and then even some of the village spaces, the commuter spaces that were sort of lost. So here's some pictures just of what, some of the things I'm talking about here with the streetscape. Here's some, the new on-street parking. We did stamped crossings. You can see planter boxes and the new plannings. And then just want to touch on some of the things we're doing with Metra. So we're actually in conversations right now with them to potentially transfer the station over to the village. It's kind of several things going on here. Obviously, Metro doesn't want the continued maintenance. They do have funding set aside to do some work on the property. And I think their thought is maybe instead of them doing it and continuing to maintain it, they would actually transfer it to us and then give us some of that funding that they had set aside to potentially, do some of the necessary work, the necessary maintenance that needs to be done. And then, the station's a little underutilized. There's some available space in there. So, maybe we could be able to do a coffee or a newsstand type concept in there, or just, whatever we can do to kind of beef up the station a little bit to make it more kind of, user friendly for transit users. Pace. Part of the Metro lot redevelopment work that we did, we actually included some Pace bus lanes, and so you got the one lane to actually pick up, they're next to the station or next to the hub there, and then there's a waiting lane too, because there's a couple bus routes that come through here, and the Pace will stop here and sometimes come and use the facilities or whatever. But it's creates a nice little transit hub in our downtown with both Pace and Metro right there. And then I just want to touch on a couple of current projects and kind of what's going on since the new zoning ordinance, which was adopted this year. or I guess first implemented, January 1st of this year. So this is a property that was a kind of a tired old 2-story commercial building, mixed use, and the property owner that purchased it, was gonna just kind of go in and rehab the residential above, and then decided that all the work that needed to be done to the property, it made more sense to be able to just kind of redevelop. And he's going from what was, kind of a smaller commercial unit for exclusively him, and I think there were 2 or 3 residents above. He's going to 5,400 square feet of commercial space, which will, include his commercial space and then actually a couple units he can rent out. And then he's going to put 12 units above. And then, he's got a variety of units, some, single and 2, and then a bunch of studios. On site, he could only fit 8 parking spaces, and we were able to accommodate really through the new zoning ordinance to be able to shared use, some of these parking spaces. And because we have a village-owned lot right across the street, so they'll be able to purchase vehicle stickers and then be able, for that lot, for their parking requirements. And then this final one is the big one I sort of touched on earlier, of the village-owned site that we've gone out to, RFP a couple times. We just entered into another agreement here recently, and I want to stress this isn't the actual rendering. This is from previous iterations of concepts that have come through, but they're all sort of similar, except the new LOI that we've got is talking about extending the property all the way north and talking 200 plus units. So we'll see if that happens. If not, they'll scale it back and do something similar to what this rendering says. But, mixed use concept, we want really, some sort of commercial or at least converted type use on that ground floor, especially on the Main Street side. And then it'll be residential above. They'll be able to accommodate a bunch of the parking on site, but we also have a village-owned lot across the street from here that we've been in conversations about being able to utilize for shared parking. So all the new design requirements from the code come into play here, the parking requirements, and then just really the process about getting these guys approved, I think will really come into play from the new ordinance. So, I'll leave it there, and then we can open this up to questions.
Great story, Kurtis. Thank you so much for sharing that, and really for all of you, Kurtis, Ian, and Jake. Thanks for sharing your insights, perspectives that are so important to understanding the connection between zoning and creating the places where we want to work and live. I know we're a little over time, so I do apologize for that. If our speakers can hang out for just a couple extra minutes in case someone has a burning question, that'd be great. There's currently no questions in the chat box, but I'll just leave it at a minute or two in case someone would like to insert a question. Please feel free to do that. And just real quickly, Kurtis, if I could ask you a question. You had mentioned in your presentation that your legal review process was relatively easy and it went well. And I'm just wondering if you could expand on that. Occasionally through zoning projects, through our program, we see that as kind of a little bit of a stumbling block, or the project might get delayed or held up a little bit through that process. Do you have any specific insights about why that went well, or why it was so successful?
Yeah, and Jake can probably chime in here a little bit too, but I don't know. It seemed pretty painless for us, and I don't know if that's just because of the CMAP's got some experience now doing a few of these zoning rewrites through the LTA program, and it's quite a significant, the new code is significantly different from kind of the standard old Euclidean kind of code, with sort of this hybrid, almost, code that CMAP's doing, now through LTA. So we kind of anticipated maybe some more hiccups going through the review, but I mean, they had a consultant on board on their side throughout the process, and then our village attorneys, when they reviewed it, didn't seem to have many issues. I think we probably did a few things, but for the most part, it was pretty seamless. And I don't know, Jake, if you have any other comments there.
Yeah, Kurtis, I would say the big thing that we did with legal is we brought them into the process as early as possible, so that they knew, what our goals were in terms of translating the comprehensive plan into zoning, and then making sure they had opportunities to review the draft ordinance as it was available. I think the biggest issue that we had with the legal review in Bensenville was the minor variations. That was the big thing, just getting the language straight on that. But otherwise, we were in really good shape.
Great. Great, sounds good. Congrats with that. So we don't have any other questions in the chat box at this point, but I do want to encourage attendees, if you're like in the middle of typing one out right now, please feel free to go ahead and submit that question before you close out this webinar, and we'll get it and we'll just find a way to answer your questions. But anyway, thank you all for joining us today. This concludes today's webinar on zoning. After taking the next week off, our Transportation Tuesday webinar series will resume again on June 2 with a session highlighting mobility pilots across our region. So please join us again if you can and if you have time for that webinar. Until then, so long, and we hope you have an enjoyable rest of the week. Bye-bye.